I'm not a golfer, but perhaps you are, or you have a family member or a friend who is. This little project only has two parts, and it's not large, but the slot and tab construction holding the display to the base requires precise cutting to look good and hold together well. I'll give you the cutting tips that will make this project a hole in one. It's winter, but that doesn't matter. A customer ordered one of these I Heart Golf signs, and I had none in stock. Fortunately, this doesn't take long to make. The plan came from some woodworking magazine and calls for half-inch material. I attach some scroll saw tape to a piece of red oak, and next I'll go to my drill press to drill the necessary pilot holes. The plans show a circle cut, or drilled, from the center of the heart shape. This is here so you can insert a clock into the space, but I'll skip that option and leave the heart solid. The base requires 3 holes for the slot and tab construction, which will hold the plaque in place much better than if the bottom was glued to the base without the tabs. A number 12 blade was in the saw from my last project, but that's several sizes too big, so I first had to switch to a number 5 Pegasus modified geometry blade. These reverse tooth blades must be mounted with most teeth pointed downward to cut correctly. The way I determine direction is to take the blade in my right hand and run it gently across my left thumb. The blade barely catches the flash in one direction, but in the other direction, friction stops it. This is the direction you want to face down when you mount the blade. I tightened the blade in the lower holder, threaded it through a pilot hole, tightened it in the upper blade holder, and then flipped up the tension lever. I started cutting with the stand, where I'll make 3 slots to accept the tabs from the sign. I'll need to cut these carefully for 2 reasons. The first is to have a solid connection, and the second is so the connection is not noticeable. From the 3/32 pilot hole, I cut to the nearest corner. I slightly backed off pressure on the blade, just enough so it was no longer cutting. Then I carefully turned the workpiece 90 degrees to the next direction I wanted to cut, and started feeding the wood into the blade again. This procedure is followed for each remaining corner. I cut right on the line for these slots, which should ensure a snug fit for the tabs. It's essential to have sharp corners or the tab won't fit correctly. If the tab is too broad or long, an unsightly gap will appear when the tab is inserted and the joint may be weakened. The tab will not fit in the slot if it's too short or narrow. If in doubt, make the slot a smidgen on the small side. You can always return with the scroll saw or a small file to enlarge it afterward. Once the slot is too large, you're stuck with a poor fit. The outside cut for the base is easy. This is a rectangle with rounded corners, so I started at one of the corners and followed the line around all the sides and corners until I arrived at the starting point. Sometimes a relaxing cut like this is a welcome respite after the exacting detail of those interior cuts. Now I can move on to the main component. It only has one interior cut for the letter O, since I will not add a clock movement. If this was a circle, I could have drilled it out with a Forstner bit, but since it's an oval, I need to cut it with the scroll saw. I started at the lower left for the long exterior sign cut. At the bottom of the eye, there's a tab to fit into one of the slots in the base, and it's essential that I cut this with 90-degree sharp corners and carefully cut right on the lines that define the length of the tab. Cutting up the left side of the letter I and cutting the top of that letter and the top of the heart doesn't present any challenges. The place where the top of the heart meets the letter G takes some skill to cut. I followed the line defining the heart shape until it met the top left of the G. The change in direction is rather sharp, so I backed the blade up in the curve just created and used the curve plus the waist area to pivot the workpiece 180 degrees. This allowed me to back the blade into the corner, and then I only had to pivot the board a few degrees to start cutting in the next direction. I used the same procedure where the O met the L, then had it easy until I reached the far side of the piece and curved around to the bottom. The golf club had a tab at its bottom. I cut to the 90-degree intersection, backed off pressure slightly on the blade, swiveled the workpiece to the new cutting direction, and then started cutting again. I used the same technique to turn at the tab's other end. Then it was clear sailing until I reached the bottom of the G, where I added the last tab. There was another tight turn on the right side of the letter G where it met the L, and then a tab on the bottom of the G. That led to another turn on the left side of the G where it met the heart shape. All of these cuts were made in the same manner I just described. This brought me back to the letter I on the left side of the display. Because I started with the left side of the tab on that letter, I only had to cut the right side to bring me back to the starting place and complete the outside cut. were not one of those tense moments of truth, checking the fit of the tabs into the slots. Only small connections hold the upper part together, so I had to press it into place carefully. The fit was too snug for my liking, considering I also had to add glue to the joint. I carefully removed the upper part. I decided to make the slot under the eye bigger, but then I had to take another look at the base to see which side to enlarge because the slot was square. There are several ways to make this correction. The first is to use the scroll saw to enlarge the slot, and I decided to use this method. However, I only needed to take a sliver off the length, so I'm not sure this would be the best choice for a scroll saw beginner. The second method would be to remove a small amount of material from the tab. This could be done on the scroll saw by anyone skilled enough to make it cut the thickness of a scroll saw blade. You could also use sandpaper or a file to make the tab smaller. The third way would be to use a file to make the slot larger. No matter your method, you must know which side of the slot, or tab, to adjust. If you cut or file incorrectly, it could change the spacing between the tabs and worsen the fit rather than improve it. Don't make any adjustments until you know it's the correct one. The correction worked and I'm happy with the fit. It's time to move on to the glue. I used a quarter sheet of 120 grit sandpaper by hand to break the edges of the base. I didn't feel like I needed to run this through the router table, as that would mean machining a larger round over than was needed. I also touched up some small spots on the back of the I Heart Golf part of the display. I used a glue bottle with a small tip to add a bead of glue to the sides of the 3 tabs. There is no point in adding glue to the bottoms because those areas won't come in contact with the base. I also added glue to the sides of each slot because those areas would come in contact with the tabs. Glue on the tabs and slots will ensure a good bond between the pieces. This assembly needed clamping pressure to hold the pieces together while the glue dried. Because of the fragile nature of the vertical piece, I decided to use one small spring clamp at each end. They fit perfectly over the tabs on the eye and the golf club. Once the glue is dry, the piece will be ready for finishing. This project had a few challenges, mainly getting a good fit between the display and base. It's winter here in Illinois, but I ship all over the country, so I may sell this batch even before the next season begins here. I'd love to read your comments on this video, and I'll reply to each one. A like will recommend this video to others and help me grow the channel. Hit the notification bell, and you'll get a reminder the next time I publish a new project. But in case you can't wait another week for more woodworking, 2 suggestions for the next video to watch are on the screen right now.